If there's one thing that I've learned in my short years, it's that there's no such thing as perfection. A perfect person, a perfect life, a perfect country, a perfect world, it's all impossible. You can't save the world, you can't fix all of its problems, and in trying to do so, it's easy to become obsessive. If you try to create a perfect world full of imperfect humans, then you might start to see those humans as the problem. Amnesia, a machine for pigs, is about that very condition, a man of incredible potential who doesn't trust the world. Mandus once squandered his family fortune in an effort to build a machine to help humanity, for the sake of his sons and his late wife. Worried that the banks would claim all he had built before his machine could change the world, he traveled to Mexico in search of Vitae, a miraculous energy source which could jumpstart his machine's work. Finding the Vitae in an Aztec temple with a long, bloody history of human sacrifice, he saw the future. In this future, World War I had claimed the lives of his sons, and World War II was just around the corner. We were only a couple years away from the turn of the century, and Mandus's vision of the 20th century was one filled with misery and bloodshed. The revelation was too much to bear, and so he spared his sons the awful future he saw. He sacrificed them at the center of the temple, like so many ancient humans before him. In Mandus's mind, the 20th century would be the one to finally break humanity. A new age of technology would give way to greedier, less caring humans, a humanity that would claim his sons' lives. And suddenly, Mandus had a purpose for his machine and the Vitae to power it. Over the coming years, Mandus grew to despise humanity for what, in his mind, they had done to his sons. With the money his machine was able to earn him from processing meat, he transformed the London Underground into a seemingly endless array of pipes, saws, wires, and cages. He'd created a machine to help the people he so desperately hated, a machine to automate the soul-cleansing sacrifices of millions of degenerates. The only way he thought he could change the future would be to offer a greater sacrifice than the Aztecs could ever muster. Hundreds, thousands, millions of people, their hearts torn out in apology, their lifeless forms reanimated and twisted beyond humanity to bring more degenerates to the slaughter. He'd caught a fever in Mexico, be it physical or mental, and in the years following, he saw all humans as degenerates, responsible for the future he had killed his children to spare them of. A child's fastest way to salvation was to keep quiet, do the life-threatening work they were asked to, and be fed to the machine once they were wounded beyond usefulness, and adults were simply fed to the machine. To Mandus, a perfect world was a world without humans, and with the power of Vitae, he had what he needed to make that a reality. There would be no World War I or II, there would be no 20th century, there would only be salvation. In Mandus's fevered mind, humanity wasn't fit to live amongst a new century of technology. That technology would inevitably consume it. Only by submitting to that fact could our souls be redeemed and our future be befitting. Well, just 24 hours before the turn of the century that he feared so much, Mandus awoke from his fever to the cries of his sons and the hum of machinery reawakening beneath his feet. The fever took such a toll on his mind that he'd suffered nearly complete amnesia, only remembering his name and that his sons needed his help. He'd been put back into the state he was in when he first saw humanity's future. Only half of a man walked out of that Aztec temple. That half-man killed his own sons and started work on the rest of humanity. Now it was time for the other half to finally leave the temple and see what he'd missed. Fleeting visions of his children teased Mandus through the hidden passages that wormed their way around the mansion, each bend and fork a punctuation mark to his own paranoia, until eventually he heard the ringing of a phone. On the other end, a voice told Mandus that his children were trapped in the lower levels of the machine, watching a flood of excrement, blood, and other waste products slowly rise, threatening to drown them. The only way to save them would be to reactivate the machine, so that the waste could be pumped away properly. Once again, Mandus was prompted to resort to human sacrifice to save his sons. Turning on the machine would surely result in more people being processed by it, but it was the only way to fix what his other half had done to his sons. Mandus could have sworn that the voice on the phone was his twin, but did he have a twin? He couldn't remember. With the guidance of the voice on the phone, Mandus made his way through corridor after bloody corridor, reactivating every sabotaged component of the great machine that he came across. He was forced to run and hide from horribly mutilated humans, resembling pigs more than men. Recordings and written notes left by himself revealed that he was responsible for these horrors too, another product of his machine. Once a human had been sacrificed, they would be reanimated using a substance called Compound X. The compound also facilitated bonding of foreign cells. The walking corpses of sacrificed humans could be combined with the otherwise unusable cuts of pigs, whose processing was once the machine's only function. What need did Mandus and his machine have of these creatures? That was still a mystery. Moving ever deeper into his creation, putting fuse to socket and coal to furnace, Mandus continued to reawaken the machine, the flood of waste growing closer and closer towards his sons, until eventually, Mandus had finally reactivated the pumps. The waste could be evacuated, the machine reawoken, and Mandus's children could be saved. The voice which guided him here spoke to Mandus, thanking him for his efforts and revealing that he had no body with which to shake his hand. That voice, through the magic of the Vitae or the marvels of computing, was Mandus's other half, and one way or another he was this machine. With this, Mandus finally overcame his amnesia and remembered what his other half had done. He remembered the slaughter, the misery, the visions of the 20th century, and he remembered what he'd done to his sons. Their non-corporeal forms stood in front of Mandus and pulled their hearts out, as Mandus recalled their sacrifice. Mandus was fooled by himself, fooled by his own creation. He'd been beaten, and all that was left to do was escape the man-pigs that now pursued him, and ride an elevator back to the streets of London, and in the final hours of the 19th century, watch his machine execute his plans.
Redeem yourselves! Redemption is at hand! Enter the cleansing and set your souls free! For you are born into filth and will die as pigs! Only through my redemption can you ascend to the skies and claim the heavens as your kingdom!
Squeals and screams rang through the streets, buildings were set to flame, men, women, and children were butchered as Mandus's mutilated and reanimated children ravaged the streets. There were too many people and not enough time. Salvation had to go quicker. The man-pigs wouldn't survive for long by their own devices, but they were dangerous and plentiful enough to give any army a run for its money, and as long as their victims could be fed to the machine, their numbers were limitless. In another time, Mandus wanted nothing more than to fix the 20th century. He wanted a world where humans didn't warmonger. He wanted a perfect world, and imperfect humans only stood in the way of that dream. Mandus knew now what he had to do. He had to stop this machine. This wasn't humanity's redemption. There could be no redeeming humanity. He could only hope to redeem himself for the sake of his children. He was going to save his soul from the evil that he'd done. Mandus went back down into the machine. He shattered pipes, he pulled gears, he ripped apart wiring until the shock scarred his hands. He promised to his late family that he would redeem himself and wash his soul of all the evil he'd done, and eventually he made it to the heart of the machine. His heart, the heart of his past self, the heart of the man that killed his sons, and he tore it out.
God help me. I am lost in the dry paper soul of the world.
He knew now that there was no hope for his soul. He was a filicidal monster. He could never redeem himself. All he could do was spare his world the shame of his funeral and die alone and forgotten, rotting amongst the rust of his legacy. Mandus, in his final hours, found himself back in the Aztec temple that once corrupted his mind. As he walked up the steps, he heard his dying alter ego pleading, telling tale of gas chambers, slavery, torture, murder, all conditions of the 20th century, and all things that Mandus himself was guilty of. He slowly worked his way to the top of this metaphysical temple, and in the very same spot his sons were killed, he tore his heart out with the press of a button, one final sacrifice to act as a footnote to Mandus's cruel tirade on humanity. He would be no messiah. His sacrifice wouldn't save humanity. He would only die alone and empty amongst his creations, the one true degenerate ever fed to his machine. The 20th century would begin with nothing but silence, only broken by war drums in the distance reverberating through miles upon miles of dead metal corridors. Nobody was saved, nobody was redeemed, and humanity stepped blindly into the bloodiest century it would ever face. And after that, we continued living.
I lay there and watched the god I had created die. At the end, when we were cold as the stone we had hewn his body from, when the lights were nearly all extinguished, we heard, in the silent distance, the man-pigs singing to one another. Then, as the last lights were gone, and we lay together in the deep, they drifted away, and all was silent. Such a silence I have never known. And as the dust settled on my open eyes, and we lay together embraced forever, I heard, miles above us, the sounds of the city turning over in its sleep. A church bell ringing out. And in that moment, the new century was born.
Before I see you all off, I'd like to verbally thank my patrons, especially those donating $10 or more monthly, for allowing me to continue doing this. Patrons such as Alex Vander Wood, Almost Dead Again, Anatoly Volnov, Andrew Melnick, Big Time Jim, Colin Gajic, Cooper Sutton, Corbet Godwin, Cosmo Borski, Daniel Christman, Darius Fazier, David Kaiser, Duncan Bristow, Fralum, Jack Eisenberg, Jano, John Strange, J.P. De La Torre, J.W., Max Binning, Mixer Rules, Money and Muses, Patio Furniture, CeeLo, Silver Silence, Vladimir's Nordholm, Wolf HD, and Young Master Pig. Thank you, and happy Halloween.